Our next speaker is David Hotson, who was born in Pennsylvania and raised in Colorado and Ontario. He founded his New York-based architectural firm in 1991 after earning an undergraduate degree from the University of Waterloo in Canada and a Master of Architecture degree from Yale University. The firm focuses on architectural space as the primary medium of design, shaping figural spatial volumes filled with natural light. The work of the office has been featured in the New Yorker, the New York Times, Architectural Record, Architectural Digest, and many other publications, and been featured on architecture and design websites in over 30 countries. The St. Sarkis Church and Community Center in Carrollton, Texas, completed in 2022, was described in the Dallas Morning News as the best new building in Texas, a breathtaking memorial to victims of genocide, the most aesthetically remarkable and emotionally moving work of architecture produced in North Texas in a generation. In January 2023, St. Sarkis Church was selected as the 2022 U.S. Building of the Year on the World Architects web platform. The church received 64% of the total votes cast for all 40 nominated projects, a result that reflects the embrace of the church within the international Armenian diaspora. David's presentation is The Making of St. Sarkis Church in Dallas.
Thank you all for coming today and for inviting me to speak. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss this project, particularly among a community who I think is perfectly prepared to offer a critical response to the approach we've taken and to the specific relationship between tradition and modernity, between precedent and innovation, invention, that has been the topic of so many of the discussions over the last few days. The Church of St. Sarkis attempts to bridge that divide between tradition and modernity by addressing the legacy of Armenian Christianity, the symbolism of archetypes within Armenian liturgical and ecclesiastical tradition, issues of memory and history, issues having to do with the reinterpretation of historical forms and archetypes, and attempting to kind of develop a certain kind of emptiness and silence in which perhaps that tradition and those memories can surface in the immediate present of the congregants as they participate in services in this new building. So to touch on the question of legacy, as many of you are no doubt aware, the Armenian homeland once encircled Mount Ararat, where the Anatolian plain meets the Caucasus Mountains. It's a mythic landscape. This, of course, is the first geographical location that we can identify precisely in the Bible. This is the mountain on which Noah's Ark is said to come to rest at the end of the biblical flood. So Armenian Christianity encircles through much of its history this magnificent mountain and this rugged Caucasus landscape. The Armenians are the first nation to convert to Christianity in 301, while the adjacent Persian and Roman empires were still persecuting Christians. And they have developed this remarkably powerful sculptural architectural tradition that obviously has very strong links to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, but also has an absolutely distinctive quality. These buildings are powerfully sculptural with this monolithic quality where walls, domes, drums, roofs are all made from the locally quarried tufa volcanic stone material, and they're still working in the same material today. Frequently they occur within monastery compounds surrounded by walls set into a breathtaking, rugged landscape of the South Caucasus. An archetype of Armenian ecclesiastical architecture is the Church of St. Jerusalem, which sits near the seat of the Armenian Apostolic Church, and it's near the capital, the contemporary Armenian capital of Yerevan. And that is the building that is the model for the Church of St. Sarkis. Jerusalem was completed in 618 AD, and the cornerstone of the St. Sarkis Church was laid exactly 1,400 years later in 2018. The building is approached through an entry courtyard framed between an athletic building and a community center building that served the needs of the community, past reflecting an oculus to the church itself, overlooking a green interior compound with a kind of perimeter of magnolia trees that is intended to rise just above the horizon, so that the building looks west over this vast Texas landscape. You approach through this sort of severely delineated entrance courtyard, which rises slightly past the reflection pool with an oculus framing the drum and dome of the church beyond. This is a transition from the busy world of suburban Dallas into what is intended to be a kind of a serene, sacred compound filled with a sense of memory and linkage across the vast gulf of space and time that connects this building to the prototype in Armenia. As you can see here, this is the building sits on a slight rise, which in North Texas is enough to give you a completely panoramic view of the horizon. So rather than looking across the rugged landscape of the South Caucasus, this building looks across the enormous empty plain of the Texas horizon. And it's to some degree that contrast that offers an explanation for the selection of this linkage between this new building and the 1,400-year-old prototype of St. Jerusalem. We're not attempting to copy the building or replicate it. It's this notion of gesturing to the gulf of time and space across which Armenians have maintained their traditions, maintained their faith in the face of the trials that this community has endured in a region of the world that has been transformed all around it from its earliest origins, when it was the sole Christian nation on earth, to its absorption within the Byzantine Empire, when the entire Mediterranean had adopted Christianity, to the rise of Islam, which happened after the Church of St. Jerusalem had already been constructed, and all the intervening clashes of the Byzantines, the Ottomans, the rise of the Soviet Union, the absorption of the Armenian, what remained of the Armenian homeland within the Soviet Union, and the diaspora that has resulted from all of these historical crises. The Armenian tradition of church building has developed a remarkable variety of forms, but one of the most distinctive is this form adopted from the Church of St. Jerusalem, which is essentially a crossing between vaulted spaces with major arches on the cardinal points and minor arches on the corners. And the result of this is an incredibly powerful structural form with these massive piers at the corners, and it's one of the reasons why these buildings were adopted in the South Caucasus, where there is high seismic activity. This building has stood through multiple earthquakes, as well as the ebb and flow of adjacent empires through the Armenian homeland. And so the building symbolizes the tenacity, the continuity, the resilience of Armenian tradition and community and Christianity. And the new building attempts to gesture to that by respecting, in a very literal way, the precedent. That this building has the precise dimensions and proportions and spatial volume of the Hypsime church, while rendered in contemporary materials and adapted to the needs of contemporary Armenian practice, with a deeper chancel and bema and sanctuary, and with a broader nave for the congregation, without the need for the powerful corner buttresses. We've sort of carried the eight-sided figure of the dome and pendentives on a. So we've carved out the space for the modern sanctuary, lowered the dome to create indirect light into the space, added a series of concealed openings that allow indirect light to be bounced into the interior while eliminating the glare from direct sunlight, which of course in Texas is an incredibly powerful source of solar heat gain. So here you see the interior of the Hypsime church, and here you see this sort of memory of the church suspended over the modern congregation with the deeper chancel and altar required by contemporary Armenian practice. So the building gestures to this very, very ancient history of St. Hypsime. It also memorializes more recent crisis of Armenian history that is in fact the origin of the diaspora, the origin of the exodus from the historic Armenian homeland in eastern Anatolia, that most of the founders of the church who come from Lebanon, what their family had experienced. As most of you are no doubt aware, Armenia once, as we said, encircled Mount Ararat in eastern Anatolia, the South Caucasus. At the end of the First World War, as the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, the descendants of the Ottoman Empire basically determined that they needed all of Anatolia for themselves, and a program of systematic expulsion and extermination of the indigenous Armenian inhabitants of eastern Anatolia took place, in which basically the Armenians were forced into the Syrian desert. The men were mostly killed. The older men, women, children were forced into the desert, most of whom perished, some of whom survived to cross over into the Levant, including the ancestors of the founders of this church who had grown up in Lebanon as a result. These are hotchkars, the gravestones, traditional gravestones of Armenian burial places. And they typically have the very distinctive Armenian cross with these branching arms, surrounded by a series of intricate rosette ornaments, each of which is different. There's this notion of the divine being represented by infinite variety and multiplicity. For this facade of the St. Sarkis Church, we developed this this graphic ornamentation based upon the Armenian cross and interwoven with geometrical and botanical ornamental motifs also derived from Armenian tradition. And as you move toward it, the cross kind of merges into this sort of intermediate layer of ornamental design. But as you get closer still, you start to see that the entire surface of the facade is pixelated, is broken down into individual ornaments of a variety of designs. As you get closer still, as you are only a matter of 3 or 4 feet away, you begin to lose the overall impression, and you begin to see that the whole facade is covered by these individual ornaments. There are in fact 1.5 million of them, and we wrote a computer script so that each one is unique. So the facade is covered by 1.5 million individual ornaments, each one distinctive, each one representing one of the 1.5 million Armenians who perished in the genocide. So the members of this congregation approach the church and can identify members of their community, ancestors, and get a sense of the enormity of this loss. They call them the 1.5 million martyrs because these are people who perished for their religious identity and belief. The experience of moving towards this facade brings you into a kind of awareness of your own vision, because as you approach, you start to see this detail at the threshold of your vision, and as you approach, it lingers right at the threshold of your vision, and you have a kind of an awareness of your own sentience that is kind of a further amplification of the significance of the facade, because you become aware that each one of these represents a sentient, experiencing individual who perished because of the same tradition that you adhere to as an Armenian worshiping in this church building. I'm going to toggle back and forth a little bit between the kind of meaning of the building and some aspects of its design as a further discussion of the relationship between tradition and modernity. And so much of this is a result of processes that are possible only now. For example, writing a computer script to generate 1.5 million pixels, distributing them across the facade to form several layers of imagery is something that was only possible as of the last few years, as is this process that was developed by an Italian company to print at high resolution on exterior grade porcelain panels that can be used as a rain screen, as a kind of a ventilated facade system. These panels were printed in Italy, laid out on the floor of their shop there to inspect everything. This actually was being done during the pandemic. They got halfway through the facade printing, and the pandemic hit northern Italy. They had to shut their shop down. When they resumed printing after the pandemic had been brought under control, they found they weren't able to perfectly match the gray tonality of the previous batch, so they reprinted everything and shipped it all to Texas, where it was installed in October and November of 2020, which is something I'll return to at the end of the talk. Another way in which we are kind of engaging with tradition, but also reinterpreting and transforming it, is in the system for bringing natural illumination into the church. As you can see, the Church of St. Eurypsika has these deep, very distinctive, deep concave recesses. It's an absolute solid block of stone where they've carved out recesses where it wasn't needed for structural stability. we've taken this same architectural element, but used it sort of in an inverse way, where we're using it as a way of reflecting natural light into the interior without giving you a direct view to the exterior. So, because the Texas sunlight is so powerful, because the glare is so intense, because the solar heat gain is so intense, we've looked to illuminate the church using completely natural light through these indirect openings. And those include the dome that's been dropped down so that light is bounced up into it. It includes these light coats on the east and the north and south facades, and the space around the central apse at the east end. And these are sort of sculpted from glass fiber reinforced concrete, and the result is an ethereal quality of illumination. We've eliminated all visible light fixtures, all visible air conditioning registers, and other distractions that remind you of the kind of contemporary technology of the building. And by also eliminating the glare from direct sunlight, we've created a very serene, luminous, spatial environment inside the building. Here is the apse at the east end of the building. It's again separated from the surrounding architecture so that the sunlight is bounced into it. And these look like renderings. This is a photograph of the building. There's nothing to distract your eye. There's no sprinkler heads, no light fixtures that and no visible visible sources of light other than the natural light that is bounced into the interior. So here again, I've shown you this once before, but I'm going to walk you through one more time. This is all about the kind of creation of indirect lighting sources that allow light to surface behind behind the visible sheet of space inside the building, so that what results is a purely sort of uniform, radiant natural illumination. Again, contemporary methods are used to create molds and cast these glass fiber reinforced concrete light coves, and to cast the multiple elements that make up the apse at the east end of the church, using contemporary construction methods at the service of a sort of reinterpretation of a deeply respected historical tradition. And here you see the kind of eight-sided dome of Peripsime lifted above the sanctuary. This is a chapel at the foot of the stairs that go up to the choir loft, illuminated by a series of intersecting spatial volumes, all lit again by indirect sources of natural light. This is the stair as you descend from the choir loft. The double curved plaster volumes of the church also represent a really remarkable technological innovation. This is in fact made by Form Glass, which is a company based in southern Ontario. Happens to be the same fabricator who worked on the Calatrava church that you all saw yesterday. They break your computer model into fragments, and they all arrive with kind of joints and seams that overlap and can be fastened together and taped and spackled into a smooth form. So you're basically going directly from the computer model of the space into the kind of fabricated kit of parts, and then into a kind of seamless envelope of smooth, scaleless gypsum painted material that sort of creates this sort of otherworldly sense of scaleless, illuminated spatial volume. Here again is our rendering, the model that was shipped to form glass in the finished sanctuary space. This is a small space over a side chapel off of the two flanking chapels that are traditional Armenian churches. The double curved pieces are made out of form glass. We frame the single curvature places, sheathe them in gypsum wallboard, and this creates this kind of luminous spatial volume that illuminates one of the side chapels. The result on the interior is an effort at creating a kind of silence in terms of visual silence, the kind of lack of any visual distraction that that surfaces you back in the sort of technological present. And it also is an acoustical silence. We designed the church so that the air conditioning and heating plant was located remotely, and the air is ducted in through a sort of a crawl space beneath the church, under the pews, with large volumes of low velocity air. So it's air moving very slowly. There's no ambient noise of what you hear here, which is air rushing through the registers at a high velocity and trying to mix all the air of the room. We use what's called displacement air conditioning, which means you just create a pool of conditioned air down where the congregation is, and you let the air stratify in the rest of the church. You don't try to mix everything. So we've eliminated the sound of that ambient sound that we're also accustomed to hearing, of high velocity air forced through small aperture registers, and we eliminated all the vibration you get from the air conditioning as well. And the result is remarkable acoustics. It is utterly silent in there. The reverberation is wonderful. This is the mechanical pit that will be surrounded by the plantings once it's grown up. But the result is, I mean, it was thrilling to attend the consecration, which happened on the 23rd of April, and the first Sunday service happened on the 24th of April, 2022, when the date on which the Armenian genocide is remembered every year is April 24th. And as it happened, the church was complete, COVID was over, and they were able to celebrate their first Sunday service on the date in which the Armenian genocide is remembered every year. And the acoustics between the clergy on the bema, on the altar, and the kind of dialogue that goes on between the choir and the choir loft, this ancient conversation handed back and forth. I don't speak Armenian, but I was entranced by the repetition, by the phrasing of the music, I was actually sitting in the church wondering if they had installed some kind of voice support for the clergy, because the acoustics were really extraordinary. The reverberation time was beautiful, and I think more than anything, it's the silence of the acoustical environment compounded in a way by a certain silence of the visual environment that harkens back to this very ancient tradition and this very ancient archetype, the very ancient vessel of space itself, but also is undeniably in the present, both the present of 2022 or 23, but also the present, the experienced present of the individual congregants. I think that there's something happening where you're sort of summoned into the present of your own experience, which I think is the place where transcendence and really occurs. So, we've very carefully sculpted the interior out of the conventions of Armenian Christianity with the slightly raised chancel and the raised bema or altar, which has been a tradition within Armenian church building. This is one of the side chapels that was illuminated by that spatial figure above. This is the sort of design of the basic 8-sided dome and pendentus from Eurypsime suspended on a broader pendentive that opens up the space for a modern congregation sitting in pews. The side chapels that, again, are illuminated by intersecting composition of spatial volumes, where it's really the empty, the figural void, rather than the solid matter that has been shaped and sculpted, and it alludes to some of the conversations that happened yesterday about the unknowability of the divine, the sort of need to describe God by what He is not, because we're incapable of understanding the divine. This notion of space, of emptiness, of a piece of the space that we move through all the time, set apart as this kind of transparent, vessel of something unknowable, is kind of summoned up, for me anyway, by giving such figural clarity to the spatial volumes themselves. This is a view from the choir loft looking down over the main congregation towards the altar, and the view during the first services there. There's more to the complex than the church. I will only very, very briefly walk you through it, just to give you a sense of how that building relates to the rest of it. Here you see a hotchkar and the enormous Texas landscape to the west. The entrance to the community center building is here, and there's a large window looking out onto the church that frames the view of the church from the 400-person assembly space. There's a wonderful mosaic derived from Armenian decorative tradition, again using a computer assembly system to create a completely distinctive ornamental mosaic, laser cut perforated screen that provides a veiled glimpse of the assembly space beyond, which looks out again over that enormous Texas landscape, has spectacular sunsets, as this kind of scattered lighting condition inside of it that softens and the kind of severity of the architecture to a degree. And all of this looks out over the central compound that will be enclosed by the magnolia trees when they've all come to maturity. So it's an effort at both respecting a very ancient tradition in an extremely deferential way, but also creating a building that stands firmly in the present, both the present of technology and construction methods available us today, but also the present of the experience of the congregation. I want to make one last point before I conclude, which is the shocking reality that at the moment this facade had arrived from Italy and was being installed in late October, early November 2020, the program of ethnically cleansing Armenians from what remains of their ancient homeland was resumed by the original perpetrators. This happened during the American elections, and during the COVID pandemic. There is an enclave in Artsakh, in what was formerly the Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan, immediately adjacent to Armenia. And essentially the perpetrators of the original genocide decided that they would use that opportunity to resume the process of expelling the original inhabitants from what remains of their ancient homeland. This is a shell that landed inside the St. Saviour Cathedral in Shushi. A whole swath of Armenian territory was lost. The Russian peacekeepers came in, and because America was asleep at the switch, and attempted to stabilize the condition. And then this last Christmas, during the very first Christmas when the St. Sarkis Church was celebrating services, the opportunity was seized by the fact that the Russians are busy in Ukraine, and they resumed the process of blockading the Armenians in Artsakh, and attempting again to systematically expel the indigenous people from their ancient homeland. It's a shocking thing to me that the most ancient Christian nation on earth remains imperiled today, that a genocide that is the prototypical genocide that was used as an example for the Holocaust is still not acknowledged by the perpetrators, and that the program is still ongoing. That the one tiny remnant of a Christian nation in what was the Eastern Mediterranean of Byzantium is still imperiled today. And if this building can possibly, I think one of the reasons why it was embraced by the international Armenian diaspora is because it attempts to tell some of that history in a way that I think is legible. And if this building can help raise awareness of the reality of the Armenians' ancient religious and cultural history, their 20th century history, and the immediate present tense reality of the continuing persecution of Armenians, I will be very gratified, and it's one of the reasons why I was grateful for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you very much.